"Don't come to your own husband's funeral, Mom. You'll just make a scene like always." Those were the words my son said to me less than an hour after my husband of 43 years took his last breath, and even now, I still remember the way the hospital hallway suddenly felt colder than the December wind outside. My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 68 years old, and until that night, I truly believed there was no pain worse than losing the man you built your entire life beside. I was wrong. The real pain came when my own child looked at me like I no longer belonged in my own family. Frank had been lying in that hospital bed for 6 days. 6 long days of listening to machines beep while pretending not to notice the fear in his eyes every time the doctors walked into the room. We had met when I was 19 years old working at a diner outside Columbus, Ohio. He used to order black coffee and cherry pie every Thursday after work, always leaving a quarter tip even when he barely had enough money for gas. Back then, he promised me 2 things. First, that he would always work hard. Second, that I would never face life alone. And for more than 4 decades he kept both promises. We raised our son Jason in a small blue house with squeaky floors and a crooked mailbox Frank never got around to fixing. Frank worked overtime at the steel plant for years so Jason could go to college without debt. I packed lunches, cleaned houses on weekends, and skipped vacations so our son could have opportunities we never had. Every Christmas morning, Jason had presents under the tree even during the years Frank and I quietly exchanged nothing but handwritten cards because money was tight. That's what parents do. You sacrifice gladly because you believe love comes back around eventually. But somewhere along the way, my son stopped seeing me as his mother and started seeing me as a burden. It didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly, in little moments I ignored because I wanted peace. The impatient sighs whenever I repeated a story. The way his wife Melissa rolled her eyes whenever I called during dinner. The way Jason started speaking to me like I was a child who needed permission to exist. Still, I never imagined he would say those words to me on the worst night of my life. Frank had only been gone 20 minutes when Jason pulled me aside near the vending machines outside the ICU. Melissa stood a few feet behind him holding her designer purse against her chest like she was late for an appointment instead of standing inside a hospital where her father-in-law had just died. Jason rubbed his forehead and wouldn't look me directly in the eye. "Mom," he said quietly, "we think it's better if you don't come to the funeral." At first, I thought I misunderstood him. "What?" I whispered. He exhaled hard like I was exhausting him already. "You get emotional. You make things harder. Dad wouldn't want drama tomorrow." Tomorrow. My husband hadn't even been gone an hour, and my son was already talking about burying him like it was another item on his schedule. I stared at Jason, searching for the little boy who used to run into my arms after Little League games, but all I saw was a stranger wearing my son's face. I did not cry in the hospital parking lot after Jason told me not to come to Frank's funeral. That was the strange part. I thought I would collapse or scream or beg my son to take those words back, but instead I just stood there holding Frank's brown leather wallet against my chest, while snow drifted quietly across the empty parking spaces around us. Jason looked relieved by my silence. Melissa gave me one of those tight little smiles people use when they think they have successfully handled a difficult situation. Then they walked away together toward the elevators without another word, leaving me standing alone under the flickering lights outside Riverside Memorial Hospital. I drove home just after midnight through streets covered in frozen slush and old snowbanks piled along the curbs. Columbus looked gray and exhausted, like the whole city had decided winter would never end. Frank always hated driving in bad weather. Every year he insisted on putting salt bags in the trunk before the first snowstorm because he said Midwestern winters had a way of humbling people who thought they were prepared. As I pulled into our driveway, I noticed the porch light was still on. Frank never went to bed without turning it off himself. For 43 years that little yellow light meant home. That night it just made the house feel empty. I sat in the car for nearly 20 minutes staring at the front door, unable to make myself go inside. My hands hurt from gripping the steering wheel too tightly. Eventually I forced myself out into the cold and walked up the steps slowly, hearing nothing except the crunch of ice beneath my boots. The moment I stepped into the kitchen, the silence hit me harder than anything Jason had said. Frank's coffee mug was still sitting beside the sink from the morning we rushed him to the emergency room. His reading glasses rested beside the newspaper he never got to finish. There was even a half-finished crossword puzzle on the dining room table with his handwriting filling in clues about baseball teams and state capitals. I reached for the chair across from mine without thinking, expecting him to still be there smiling at me over his glasses the way he always did after dinner. Instead, there was only an empty seat and a quiet house that no longer felt like mine. Around 2 in the morning, my phone buzzed with a text from Melissa. "We are meeting with the funeral home at 10 tomorrow. We will let you know the arrangements afterward." That was it. No kindness. No sympathy. Not even a simple "Are you okay?" I read the message 3 times trying to understand how I had suddenly become someone who needed updates about her own husband's funeral like a distant relative. I started typing back twice before deleting every word. There was no point. They had already decided my role in all this. A few minutes later, I noticed something else that made my stomach tighten. Jason had not asked me a single question about what Frank wanted. Not about the music. Not about the service. Not about burial plans. Nothing. My husband had spent 43 years building a life beside me, and somehow our son was acting like I was just an inconvenience standing in the way of his schedule. Then at exactly 2:17 in the morning, another text came through from Jason. "Also, Mom, Melissa and I think it is best if you stay home for a few days after the funeral. You need rest." I stared at those words for a long time before I finally realized what was happening. They were not trying to protect me. They were trying to remove me. The next morning, I woke up in the same armchair where I must have fallen asleep sometime before dawn. My neck ached, and the television in the living room was still glowing softly with one of those late-night infomercials nobody actually watches. For a few seconds I forgot what had happened. Then I saw Frank's coat hanging beside the front door, and the truth came rushing back so fast it stole the air from my lungs. I walked into the kitchen and automatically reached for 2 coffee mugs before stopping myself halfway through. 43 years of habit does not disappear overnight. Outside, snow covered the backyard in a smooth white blanket. Frank used to joke that winter made everything look peaceful even when it was not. I stood at the sink holding the coffee pot, wondering how my life had turned into something I no longer recognized in less than 24 hours. Around 9 that morning, I called Jason. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. I waited a few minutes and called again. This time Melissa answered. Her voice sounded polished and controlled, the same tone she used with customer service employees and neighbors she secretly disliked. "Hi Evelyn," she said, "not Mom, never Mom anymore. Jason is busy meeting with the funeral director right now. I would like to know what is happening," I said quietly. "I am his wife." There was a pause long enough for me to picture her covering the phone with her hand and rolling her eyes. "We are handling things," she replied. "You should focus on resting." Handling things. As though my husband's funeral was some inconvenient business meeting I was emotionally unqualified to attend. I thanked her anyway because women my age were raised to stay polite even while being dismissed. After the call ended, I walked upstairs to my bedroom and opened Frank's closet. His flannel shirt still smelled faintly like cedar and aftershave. I pressed one against my face and finally allowed myself to cry, not loudly, just quietly enough that the sound stayed trapped inside my chest. Frank had always been the steady one between us. When Jason got suspended in high school for fighting, Frank was the one who drove to the principal's office. When the mortgage company threatened foreclosure during the recession, Frank picked up weekend shifts without complaint. When my mother died, he held my hand every night for weeks because he knew silence hurt less when someone shared it with you. And now he was gone, and somehow the only people who should have been standing beside me were acting like I was a problem they needed to manage. Around noon, my best friend Grace Nolan knocked on the door carrying a casserole dish wrapped in towels against the cold. Grace and I had known each other since our 20s when our husbands coached Little League together. She took one look at my face and immediately knew something was wrong. "Evelyn," she said softly, setting the dish on the counter, "why do you look like someone just threw you out of your own family?" I tried to defend Jason at first. Mothers do that even when they should not. I told her he was stressed and grieving and overwhelmed, but then the words started spilling out before I could stop them. The hospital, the funeral, the texts, the way Melissa spoke to me. Grace listened without interrupting, her mouth tightening more with every sentence. Finally, she said something that sat heavy in my stomach long after she left. "Honey, this does not sound like grief. she said carefully. It sounds like they are trying to push you aside before you can ask questions. That evening, I drove past the funeral home without planning to. The parking lot was crowded with cars. Jason's black SUV sat near the entrance beside Melissa's white Lexus. I almost kept driving. But then I noticed something that made my hands tighten around the steering wheel. Hanging in the front window was a large printed memorial photo of Frank smiling in his Navy veteran cap. Underneath the picture, the sign read, "Beloved Father and Grandfather." My name was nowhere on it. I sat in the parking lot across from the funeral home for nearly 10 minutes, staring at that memorial photo in the window while snowflakes melted slowly against my windshield. Beloved father and grandfather. Not husband. Not soulmate. Not the man who danced barefoot with me in our kitchen on Sunday mornings while bacon burned in the pan because neither of us was paying attention. Just father and grandfather. It was as if 43 years of marriage had been erased with the click of a computer mouse. I almost walked inside right then. Part of me wanted to march through those front doors and demand an explanation in front of everyone. But another part of me, the quieter part Frank always trusted most, told me to wait and pay attention. Something about all of this felt wrong in a way I could not yet explain. I drove home just before dark, and when I turned onto our street, I noticed Jason's SUV parked in the driveway. The porch light was on again. For a brief second, I allowed myself to hope maybe he had come to apologize. Maybe grief had overwhelmed him and he finally realized how cruel he had been. But the moment I walked through the front door, I knew that was not why he was there. Melissa stood in the living room holding a stack of file folders against her chest, while Jason was opening drawers in Frank's desk. Neither of them looked surprised to see me. "What are you doing?" I asked quietly. Jason barely glanced up. "We are organizing Dad's paperwork." Without asking me first? Melissa sighed dramatically before Jason could answer. "Evelyn, there are bills and insurance forms and legal documents that need attention immediately. We are trying to help." Help. That word again. Always delivered in that calm, rehearsed tone people use when they are trying to make you feel unreasonable. I stepped closer to the desk and noticed several folders already stacked neatly beside Jason. Bank statements. Property tax records. Retirement accounts. Frank had always kept our paperwork carefully organized in labeled binders because he believed confusion created opportunities for mistakes. Or for dishonest people. The thought slipped into my mind before I could stop it. Jason suddenly closed one drawer faster than necessary when he noticed me looking. "Dad told me where everything important was," he said. "We are just making things easier for you." But Frank would never have excluded me from conversations about our own finances. Never. My husband still asked my opinion before buying a new toaster oven after 40 years of marriage. The idea that he secretly planned all of this with Jason made no sense. Melissa walked toward the kitchen carrying a folder marked Home Documents. "You really should think about downsizing eventually," she said casually over her shoulder. "This house is a lot for one person your age." My age. I noticed how quickly they had both started talking about me like someone fragile and temporary, as if I were already halfway gone myself. Jason finally looked at me directly then, but there was impatience in his eyes instead of concern. "Mom, you do not need to worry about all this anymore. Melissa and I are handling everything." I stared at my son standing in the middle of the home, his father built with his own hands 37 years ago. The same son Frank coached through baseball practice every Saturday morning. The same boy I once sat beside all night in an emergency room after he broke his arm falling out of a tree at age 10. Suddenly I realized something painful. Jason was not grieving like a son who lost his father. He was moving like a man rushing to secure something before somebody else got there first. Then, just as Melissa reached for another folder, a small white envelope slipped loose and fell onto the carpet near my feet. My name was written across the front in Frank's handwriting. The room went completely still after that envelope hit the floor. Even Melissa stopped moving for a second. I bent down slowly and picked it up before either of them could react. My hand started trembling the moment I recognized Frank's handwriting. He had a very particular way of writing my name, the E looping slightly backward because he learned cursive from strict Catholic school teachers back in the 1960s. Nobody could fake that. "What is that?" Jason asked too quickly. I looked up at him and for the first time since Frank died, I saw something flicker across my son's face that did not look like grief or annoyance. It looked like panic. "It has my name on it," I said quietly. Melissa forced a smile that never reached her eyes. "It is probably just an old note." But I noticed she had stopped clutching the folders. Her fingers tightened around the edges instead. I slid one finger carefully beneath the seal and unfolded the paper inside. The letter was short, written in blue ink on one of the yellow legal pads Frank always kept beside his recliner. "Evelyn, if you are reading this, it means I did not get the chance to tell you everything myself." I felt my throat tighten immediately. Frank's voice practically echoed through my mind as I read his words. "There are things about Jason and Melissa you do not see because your heart always looks for the good in people. Promise me you will pay attention now." I glanced up slowly. Jason shifted uncomfortably beside the desk while Melissa crossed her arms defensively. Neither of them asked to read the letter. That told me more than enough already. Frank continued, "Over the last year, Jason has pressured me several times about the house, the savings, and changing paperwork. I tried to believe he was only worried about the future, but something stopped feeling right. I have made copies of everything important and left them where only you would think to look. Do not let anyone rush you into signing anything after I am gone." My chest felt cold. I read the final lines twice because I could hardly believe them. "If they ever try to make you feel confused or unwanted in your own home, remember this house belongs to the life we built together, not to the people waiting to inherit it. I love you, Evie. Always." The room stayed silent after I lowered the paper. Outside, wind rattled softly against the kitchen windows while snow slid off the roof in heavy clumps. Jason rubbed his jaw and finally spoke first. "Dad was paranoid toward the end," he muttered. "The medication made him emotional." Emotional. The same word they used about me. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my sweater pocket. "Where are the copies?" I asked. Jason immediately looked away. Melissa answered instead. "We have no idea what he meant by that." But her voice had changed. It sounded tighter now, less polished. I walked past both of them toward the hallway closet before I even fully understood why. Frank and I had spent decades hiding spare cash and Christmas gifts around the house because he loved surprising people. Sometimes he joked that after he died I would probably discover hidden notes for the next 20 years. The memory almost made me smile until I reached the linen shelf and saw the old navy blue toolbox sitting exactly where Frank always kept it. My heartbeat quickened. Jason followed me down the hallway. "Mom, seriously, you are exhausted. You should not start imagining things because of one letter." I ignored him and opened the metal box. Inside were several neatly labeled envelopes, a flash drive, and a thick folder marked in black marker with two words that instantly made my stomach drop. "Property records." Then I noticed something else beneath the folder. A second envelope. This one had only 4 handwritten words across the front. "Read this alone." I carried the second envelope upstairs to my bedroom and locked the door behind me even though my own son had never given me a reason to fear him before this week. That realization alone nearly broke my heart. The house felt different now, less like a home and more like a place where everybody was pretending. Downstairs, I could hear muffled voices between Jason and Melissa, low and tense, followed by cabinet doors opening and closing. They were still searching through Frank's things while I sat on the edge of our bed staring at the envelope in my lap. "Read this alone." Frank had underlined the word alone twice. My fingers shook as I opened it carefully. Inside was another handwritten letter along with several folded bank documents clipped together. "Evelyn, if Jason is already pushing you aside, then things happen faster than I hoped they would. I am sorry for leaving you to deal with this. The doctors gave me more time than I expected, but not enough to fix everything myself." I stopped reading for a second because tears blurred the page. Frank always apologized even for things that were never his fault. He apologized when it rained during vacations. He apologized when the furnace broke during Christmas. And now he was apologizing for dying. I wiped my eyes and continued reading. 6 months ago, Jason asked me to transfer ownership of the house early. He said it would make things easier later and help avoid taxes. Melissa pushed hard for it, harder than felt normal. When I refused, they became angry. That sentence sent a cold wave through my chest. I remembered Jason suddenly visiting more often this past year. the expensive steak dinners he brought over, the way Melissa suddenly insisted on helping me organize closets and paperwork. At the time, I thought maybe they were finally becoming thoughtful in middle age. Now every memory looked different. Frank's letter continued. I told them the house stays yours no matter what happens to me. After that conversation, Jason stopped calling me every Sunday like he used to. I do not think he realizes how much I noticed. I covered my mouth with one hand. Frank had known. He had seen everything quietly happening while still trying to protect our son in front of me. That was the kind of father he was. Even disappointed, he loved deeply. Attached to the letter were copies of account statements and legal forms. One paper immediately caught my attention because Jason's name appeared beside several withdrawal requests from a joint savings account Frank and I barely touched except for emergencies. The dates were recent. Very recent. Another form showed paperwork started for a property consultation with a real estate company I had never heard of. My stomach twisted harder with every page. Nobody had mentioned selling the house directly to me, yet documents were already moving behind my back. Then I reached the final page clipped beneath the others. It was not financial paperwork. It was a business card. Attorney Daniel Mercer. Family estate law. On the back, Frank had written one sentence. He knows everything. Trust him. Before I could fully process what I was reading, somebody knocked lightly on the bedroom door. Mom. Jason's voice sounded careful now, almost nervous. Can we talk? I folded the papers quickly and slipped them back into the envelope just as the doorknob turned slightly beneath his hand. I am tired, I answered. Silence lingered outside for several seconds. Then Jason spoke again, softer this time. I know this is hard. But Melissa and I are trying to help you make smart decisions. Smart decisions. Another phrase people use when they think older women are becoming confused. I looked around the bedroom Frank and I had shared since 1989. The faded curtains we picked together. The oak dresser he spent 2 weekends building by hand. The framed photo from our 40th anniversary trip to Maine hanging above the bed. Suddenly I understood something clearly for the first time since his death. They were not grieving with me. They were positioning themselves around what they thought would soon belong to them. The morning of the funeral arrived gray and bitterly cold, the kind of Ohio winter morning where the sky looks heavy enough to collapse onto the rooftops. I barely slept the night before. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Jason's voice telling me not to come, followed by Frank's handwriting warning me not to trust what I was seeing. Around 7 in the morning, I sat alone at the kitchen table holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold long ago, while snow drifted quietly past the windows. Frank's funeral was scheduled for 11 o'clock at St. Matthew's Church across town. For 43 years, I had stood beside that man through every important moment of our lives, and now my own son expected me to disappear quietly while strangers mourned him in my place. My phone buzzed shortly after 8. Another text from Melissa. We think it is best if you stay home today. People are emotional already. No kindness. No invitation. Just instructions. I stared at the message for a long moment before finally setting the phone face down on the table. Something inside me had changed during the last 48 hours. The confusion was slowly hardening into clarity. Frank had not hidden those letters because he was paranoid. He hid them because he knew exactly what was coming. Around 9:30, Grace arrived wearing a dark wool coat and carrying 2 cups of fresh coffee from the diner near her house. One look at me and she understood immediately. You are going, she said firmly before I even spoke. I shook my head weakly. Jason does not want me there. Grace pulled out the chair across from me and leaned forward. Evelyn, listen to me carefully. You buried your parents. You buried your brother. Now you are burying your husband. Nobody gets to tell you that you do not belong at his funeral. I looked down at my hands wrapped around the mug. I do not want a scene. Grace's expression softened. Then do not make one. Just show up with dignity. Let them explain to the world why his wife is unwelcome. Those words stayed with me all morning, while I dressed slowly in the black coat Frank bought me for our anniversary 5 winters ago. I chose the pearl earrings he always said made me look elegant and pinned my silver hair back carefully even though my hands trembled the entire time. When I finally stood in front of the bedroom mirror, I barely recognized the exhausted woman staring back at me. But beneath the grief there was something else now. Resolve. St. Matthew's parking lot was nearly full when Grace pulled in just before the service started. I immediately recognized Jason's SUV near the front entrance beside Melissa's Lexus. Through the church windows I could see people gathering inside beneath warm golden lights while snow collected quietly on the stone steps outside. My chest tightened as I realized how many people would be inside mourning Frank while believing I simply chose not to come. Grace squeezed my hand once before we walked toward the entrance together. The moment we stepped inside the church foyer, conversations around us slowed. Several people looked surprised to see me. Frank's old co-worker Harold immediately approached with tears in his eyes. "Evelyn," he said softly, hugging me carefully, "I kept wondering where you were." Before I could answer, I heard Melissa's sharp voice from across the foyer. "Jason." I turned and saw both of them standing near the sanctuary doors. Jason's entire body went stiff the moment he saw me. Melissa looked furious beneath her carefully arranged expression of grief. For several long seconds nobody moved. Then Jason walked toward me quickly while keeping his voice low and controlled. "Mom," he said tightly, "what are you doing here?" I looked directly into my son's eyes and answered with more calm than I actually felt. "I came to say goodbye to my husband." For a moment, Jason looked like he might actually tell me to leave right there in the middle of the church foyer. His jaw tightened, and I could see the same stubborn expression he used to wear as a teenager whenever Frank caught him lying about where he had been after curfew. But this was not a teenage mistake anymore. This was something colder, more calculated. Around us, people had started pretending not to watch while very obviously listening to every word. Melissa stepped forward quickly, her smile stretched painfully thin. "Evelyn, we were only worried about your emotional state today," she said softly enough for nearby guests to hear. "We did not want this to overwhelm you." I almost admired how easily she performed concern in public. Almost. Before I could answer, Pastor Raymond approached from the sanctuary entrance with a warm but confused expression. He took both my hands gently in his. "Evelyn," he said, "I am relieved you came. Frank would never have wanted you absent today." The silence that followed those words felt enormous. I looked directly at Jason. He immediately glanced away. Pastor Raymond clearly sensed tension but wisely said nothing more. Instead, he guided me toward the sanctuary doors while people quietly greeted me with hugs and condolences. Several looked genuinely surprised to see me there at all. One woman even whispered, "Melissa told us you were too unwell to attend." That sentence settled heavily inside my chest. They had already been preparing explanations for my absence before I ever made a decision myself. Inside the sanctuary, soft piano music floated through the air while snow fell beyond the stained glass windows. Frank's casket rested near the altar surrounded by white lilies and framed photographs from different stages of his life. Navy pictures, fishing trips, family vacations. In every single photo, Jason stood proudly beside his father. Yet somehow there was not one photograph displaying Frank and me alone together. Not one from our wedding. Not one from anniversaries. Not one from the countless years that existed before Jason was even born. I sat quietly in the last pew beside Grace while guests continued filling the church. Jason and Melissa remained near the front greeting people like hosts at a formal event. Every few minutes Melissa dabbed carefully at dry eyes with a tissue while Jason accepted handshakes and sympathetic pats on the shoulder. Watching them from a distance, they looked like the perfect grieving family. Nobody would have guessed they tried to erase the widow before the service even began. Then the funeral started. Pastor Raymond spoke beautifully about Frank's loyalty, his humor, and his deep devotion to family. I listened while clutching the folded letters hidden inside my purse. Several times I caught Jason glancing back toward me with visible irritation, as though my simple presence had ruined something important to him. Finally Jason stood to deliver his eulogy. He walked confidently to the podium and cleared his throat while Melissa watched proudly from the front row. "My father taught me integrity," he began. "He taught me what family responsibility looks like." I felt Grace stiffen slightly beside me. Jason continued speaking about sacrifice, honesty, and protecting loved ones. Every sentence sounded polished and rehearsed. He described himself as Frank's caretaker during the final months, the person handling difficult decisions and keeping the family together through grief. Not once did he mention me. Not once did he acknowledge the woman who stood beside Frank for over 4 decades. Then Jason smiled sadly and said something that made the entire church suddenly feel smaller around me. Dad always worried about emotional instability affecting important moments, he said carefully. But he taught me that protecting family sometimes means making difficult choices. Several people nodded sympathetically, believing they understood what he meant. But I understood perfectly. He was humiliating me publicly without ever saying my name. Grace leaned toward me furiously, whispering, "Oh my God." But I barely heard her anymore because at that exact moment, Pastor Raymond slowly turned his head toward Jason with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Disappointment. Jason froze for half a second after noticing Pastor Raymond's expression, but then he recovered quickly and continued reading from the folded paper in his hands as though nothing had happened. People in the congregation kept nodding politely while he spoke about honor and family loyalty, unaware that the woman he was quietly humiliating sat only a few pews away listening to every word. I lowered my eyes to my purse where Frank's letters rested beneath my gloves. My husband spent the final months of his life preparing for a betrayal I refused to believe was possible. That realization hurt almost as much as losing him. When Jason finally finished speaking, polite applause echoed softly through the sanctuary. He returned to his seat beside Melissa, who squeezed his hand proudly. Then Pastor Raymond stepped back to the podium. He stood silently for a moment, looking across the room with the calm expression people trusted during their hardest moments. Frank Carter was many things, he began slowly. A veteran, a father, a loyal friend. But above all else, he was a devoted husband. The room became very quiet. I saw Melissa's smile fade slightly. Pastor Raymond continued. In all my years counseling families, I have rarely seen a marriage built on the kind of quiet faithfulness Frank and Evelyn shared. Several people turned toward me warmly. Jason shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Frank visited me privately 3 weeks ago, Pastor Raymond added carefully. He spoke at length about his love for his wife and his concern that she would not be treated with the respect she deserves after his passing. I heard Grace inhale sharply beside me. Jason's head snapped upward immediately. Pastor Raymond did not raise his voice or sound angry. Somehow that made his words even more powerful. Before today's service, he continued, I was surprised to learn Evelyn believed she was unwelcome here. I would like to say clearly in front of everyone gathered today that no husband who loved his wife the way Frank did would ever want her excluded from saying goodbye. A ripple of uneasy silence spread across the sanctuary. Melissa stared straight ahead, her face pale beneath carefully applied makeup. Jason looked furious now, but there was nothing he could say without exposing himself further. For the first time since Frank died, I saw uncertainty replace confidence in my son's eyes. Pastor Raymond then turned gently toward me. Evelyn, he said softly, would you like to say a few words? My heart pounded so hard I thought people might hear it. I had not planned to speak, but as I slowly stood from the pew, I suddenly realized something important. I was done shrinking myself to make dishonest people comfortable. The sanctuary fell completely silent while I walked toward the podium. Snow tapped softly against the stained glass windows as every face turned toward me. I unfolded one of Frank's letters with trembling fingers but kept my voice calm. Frank spent 43 years taking care of this family. I began quietly. And in the end, his greatest fear was not dying. It was leaving me behind unprotected. Jason's expression changed instantly. Panic flashed across his face again. I continued before he could interrupt. My husband left written instructions, legal documents, and copies of financial records because he believed people might try to pressure me after his death. A few gasps sounded quietly through the church. Melissa whispered something urgently to Jason, but he stayed frozen in place. I looked directly at my son then, not angrily, just sadly. Frank taught me many things during our marriage, I said. But the most important lesson was this. Real family does not erase you when you become inconvenient. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound came from the heating vents humming softly above the pews. Then from the back row near the church entrance, a deep voice suddenly broke the silence. Mrs. Carter? I turned and saw a tall gray-haired man removing his winter coat beside the doors. I apologize for arriving late, he said calmly. I am Daniel Mercer. Your husband asked me to attend today if necessary. Jason's face lost all color.